Well, hey, good morning. Last week we started this new series called Lines, and we began to explore this idea of why God puts boundaries and lines in our lives, and why are they there to begin with. And we discussed lines are important. Some of you may know this. I coached the 8th grade girls basketball team at the Upper Grade Center here in Bourbonnais. And as you might imagine, there's a lot of teaching that goes on when you coach 8th grade girls basketball, a lot of fundamentals, and it requires quite a bit of patience from time to time, right? For example, last year, I had a young lady on our team, and she was outstanding. I mean, she gave me everything that she had, every practice that we had, every game that we had. She was one of my best rebounders. She was one of my best defenders, but she had a problem. She had a problem. She would hustle. She would dive on the floor for loose balls. She would get a steal, and she would start to dribble the ball, and she wouldn't pay attention, and she would start dribbling on the out-of-bounds lines. Sometimes she would dribble right out of the out-of-bounds lines, sometimes 3 or 4 feet outside the out-of-bounds lines. And inevitably, the referee would blow his whistle. That's a turnover. The ball goes back to the other team, and she always had this look of bewilderment on her face, like, what did I do? What? I don't understand. So one time in a game we were playing, she had done this 3 or 4 times, I believe, before halftime. And I had to call a timeout for something else. And as she was walking off the floor, I went over and put my arm around her. I said, "You're doing an outstanding job. I mean, you're hustling, you're getting rebounds. But do you see these lines that surround the court? These are not a suggestion. When you have the ball, you can't dribble on them or outside of them." And she smiled, and she looked at me, she nodded as if she got it, and then she went on to proceed to do it several more times the rest of the game. 8th grade girls basketball. I love it. I love it. Lines are important. Lines are important. Whether we're playing games, they're important. They're important in other areas of our lives, and God puts lines and boundaries in our lives for a reason. Now, the world will tell us that those lines are restrictive, that they keep you from being all that you can be, right? That they'll rob you of the freedom that you hope for and you desire in your life. But God puts lines in our lives because there's a purpose. God wants to protect us from something that can cause us harm, or He wants to provide something for us that is far better than what we could imagine on our own. Last week, Pastor Paul gave us an excellent lead-in to this series as he talked about why God puts lines and boundaries in our lives and why it's important. And if you didn't get a chance to be here last week or watch online, I would highly suggest that you go back and watch and maybe even rewatch it if you were here. Because the things that Pastor Paul shared with us was practical advice. And if you're a follower of Jesus, it's a must. But even if you're not a follower of Christ, if you don't consider yourself a Christian, it was good advice in every aspect and will help in every aspect of our lives. And so this week, we're going to get a little bit more specific as we talk about lines and boundaries in our lives. And so I want to start off and I want to ask you a question. Just something, don't say it out loud, just something to think about. Have you ever met somebody in your life that later on you wish you would not have met? Maybe that's a little too personal. Got really quiet all of a sudden. Maybe let me ask it a different way. Maybe has your spouse, your son or your daughter, somebody like that, has they met somebody in their lives where you wish later on, I wish they would never have met that person? I think if we were to answer that question, honestly, the answer would be yes. I think we all have been in that situation at some point in time in our lives. We all have a story like that. And it's such a strange dynamic, isn't it? It's such a strange dynamic. As a high school pastor, I talk to our high school students about this topic often. Be careful who you spend your time with. Be careful who you allow into your inner circle, who you allow to have influence in your life, that you're not surrounding yourself with people that may take you down a path that you really don't want to go. And those of you who are parents, you probably have had a similar conversation with your children. And if you haven't yet, you probably will in the near future. But what we're going to talk about today is not just for high school students. It's not just for teenagers. Because the same can be said about our adult relationships as well. Because isn't it true that we can look back on our lives and agree that because of some of the people that we've met, some of the people that we've allowed into our inner circle, those relationships have led to some of our greatest regrets. Now, that might sound a little bit harsh. Here's the truth. I don't know what your greatest regret is, but I bet that you weren't alone when it happened. And even if you were alone when that regret happened, there was probably a connection to some relationship somewhere along the line. And so it's a strange thing that oftentimes our greatest regrets involve people that we are closest with. They aren't our enemies. People that we consider our enemies, we keep our guard up when we're around them, right? It didn't happen with our enemies, but our greatest regrets in life usually happen with people that we consider to be somebody that is a friend. So we're talking about lines and boundaries today. And lines and boundaries, I think we all would agree, are designed to keep us safe. They're designed to keep us from going places that are off limits, that may even be dangerous. And so I want us to think about something that I think all of us have a concept of, about the lines that are painted on a road, right? When the lines are painted on a road, they help us know which lane we're supposed to stay in, when it's okay to pass a car, when we shouldn't pass a car. They help keep us going in the right direction. Maybe when you're going around a curve or you see a steep hill, there may be these metal barriers. We call them guardrails, right? It's another warning sign that there may be danger just around the way. And so those lines and boundaries there, they serve to protect us and direct us. And interestingly enough, those lines and guardrails, when we see them, they are painted, they are put in the safe areas, right? They aren't put outside where there's already danger. They're designed to keep us out of that trouble. For example, if you drive on Career Center Road, many of you drove on Career Center this morning to get here at GatheringPoint. Career Center is a fairly narrow road. And you probably noticed that in some spots, the drop-off from the pavement to that tiny little gravel berm, right, is fairly steep. And if you were to veer off there, it's kind of difficult to get your car back on the road without kind of overcorrecting and shooting you over into the other lane. And so even though that road is narrow, those lines that are painted in the safe zone help you stay safe. If you stay within the lines, you'll be fine. And nobody really argues with that logic of placing lines and boundaries within the safe zone before we get into trouble where it could be dangerous. Think about guardrails, right? We lived in Virginia for several years, and it was a much more mountainous region, and so there were guardrails all over the place. And those guardrails were designed to keep us safe, but to minimize the damage that could happen in our lives, right? So if you're driving late at night, maybe you fall asleep, maybe you get distracted by a conversation you're having with somebody, and maybe you veer off and you hit a guardrail. I mean, you'll do a little bit of damage to your car, but it won't be near the damage that would have happened had you driven off a cliff, right? So the guardrail, it might cause us to go to the body shop for a moment, but it protects us all around. And the truth is, we need those kind of boundaries in our lives, not just on the road. Some of our biggest regrets in life may have been completely avoided if we just would have put lines and boundaries in our lives, if we would have chose to stay inside those lines and boundaries, financially, personally, professionally, relationally. And I think we all would agree with that. But the problem is this: we live in a world that doesn't encourage lines. It doesn't encourage boundaries, right? It feels too much like rules and restrictions. And at the same time, that same culture that says you don't need lines in your life, you don't need boundaries in your life, you need freedom. That same culture will laugh at us and mock us and shame us when we find ourselves in a ditch, relationally or morally. And so it's an important idea and topic for us to talk about here. And it's why we're spending time talking about it. And today we're going to specifically talk about lines as it pertains to our friends and to our associates and to our inner circles. Those people that we run with, that we play with, that we work with. Because like we said, those people that we've met, those people that we've allowed inside, many times they are part of our biggest regrets in life. And maybe that sounds really judgmental. Maybe that sounds really judgmental because these are people that I work with. These are people that I've known for a really long time. They're good people, right? And it sounds like you're asking me to be judgmental of them. But this isn't about being judgmental. Actually, it's about exercising good judgment. And there's a big difference between the two. Being judgmental is when I draw a harsh or a critical assessment, conclusion about who you are, and I expect you to act differently. That's being judgmental. Good judgment, on the other hand, is about drawing conclusions about myself based on wisdom. Good judgment is about me. Good judgment is about drawing conclusions about my life based on my past, my present, and my future. Understanding what my past experiences are and what I may fall into temptation with, understanding where my current life circumstances are and where I'm at in life, and in light of understanding my future hopes and dreams, what is the best thing for me? What is the wisest thing that I can do? Not for everybody else, but for me. We already said, we asked the question, there's probably at least one person that we can think of. Some of us, there's a handful of people that we can think of that we say we wish we had never met. Is that being judgmental? It's not. It's hindsight saying I wish I would have used better judgment so that I didn't experience maybe some pain and regret that I have now. Now, if that doesn't help, maybe we can look at it from a different perspective. Let's take a trip back in time to when you and I were kids, and our parents were somewhat fanatical about who we spent time with, right? Now, I realize every generation is different about how they went about this, but I think at the heart of the matter, it was all our parents cared about who we were spending time with, who was having influence in our lives. I mean, they were borderline paranoid, right? And some of you weren't allowed to go to that one kid's house. Some of you may have been that one kid. I don't know, right? But you weren't allowed to go to that one kid's house. Some of you put a for sale sign. Your parents put a for sale sign in their front yard. And they said, we're moving. Like, I'm pulling you out of this school. We're going to send you to a different school. Some of your parents would have had arranged marriages if that was a thing when you were kids, right? And you thought it was ridiculous. I thought it was ridiculous. And we probably even told our parents, like, you're being so judgmental. This isn't fair. These are my friends. But now that you're a parent, you understand. You get it. You're even worse when it comes to your kids. And do you know why? Because you remember who your friends were, right? You remember the kind of things that happened. And so now we have security cameras in our homes, right? You check your kids' social media pages to see what's going on and what's happening, right? We create things that we probably would never do. Like, we create Snapchat and TikTok accounts as adults, and we go, I'm not even sure what this is, but it allows me to peer into the life of what my kid is doing, or better yet, what the kids they're hanging out with, what they're doing. And guess what? Your kids probably say the same thing to you that you said to your parents. You're being so judgmental. This isn't fair. These are my friends. And what do we say? No. We're exercising good judgment. Because you may not have known it then, but you certainly know it now. You know what mom and dad knew at the time, that our friendships help determine the direction and the quality of our life. And that is a simple truth. And the same thing that makes friendships so wonderful is also the very same thing that can make friendships dangerous. The thing that makes friendships so great is that you have things in common. It's easy, right? It's relaxing. You can put your guard down around your friends. And that's the way that it's supposed to be. And with some groups of people, that's a safe thing to do. But there are other groups of people where that could be the potential for something hazardous to happen. And again, that's not good or bad, it's just what it is, and we need to be aware of it. And maybe you know this, and maybe you don't, but we all crave acceptance in our lives. Regardless of what our environments are, we crave acceptance. We're drawn to people that make us feel safe and accepted. And that craving, many times, leaves us open to influence. Negative influence or positive influence. And so many of our addictive behaviors, many of those things that we can look back on and say, I have regret about this in my life, began in a crowd or a small group of friends, or maybe just an acquaintance that maybe we let into our inner circle a little bit too far. Which brings us back to that question that we asked earlier. When you think about what your greatest regret is in life, were you with an enemy or were you with a friend? Morin Cerf is a neuroscientist. He works right up the road at Northwestern University. He's been studying decision-making in humans for many years. And he's made some fascinating discoveries. And here's one of the things that he has learned in his research. That when two people are in each other's company over a period of time, their brain waves begin to look nearly identical. So they hook up these electrodes, and I don't know exactly how it works, but they print out these brain waves and what it's supposed to look like. And before there's any behavioral changes or anything like that, the brain waves begin to look identical. I mean, that seems nuts to me that kind of thing happens, right? And maybe that encourages you because you go, I'm hanging out with some good people. Or maybe it discourages you because you go, I'm not sure that that's what I want my life to be. But here's what Morin Cerf, the neuroscientist, says. The more we study engagement, we see time and time again that just being next to certain people actually aligns your brain with them. So look to the left or right and see who you're spending time with, right? That could be kind of scary. He continues on. If we want to maximize happiness, which we all do, and if we want to minimize stress, which we all do, we should build a life that requires fewer decisions by surrounding ourselves with people who embody the traits they prefer. Without any effort, if you surround yourself with the kind of people who embody the traits that you want for your life, that you desire for yourself, your brain will begin to automatically line up and sync. And so lastly, he says, over time, by being next to these people, you'll naturally pick up on those desirable attitudes and behaviors. Now, of course, the flip side is also true. You can pick up undesirable attitudes and behaviors with no effort, just by being in proximity of a certain group of people. Just being with people who are moving in a certain direction that maybe you don't want to be going. And something happens in our brains that starts to align with them. So is that being judgmental? No. It's just years and years of study and research, and it's what science tells us, right? And so this is about exercising good judgment. It's about exercising good judgment because whether you're 16 years old or you're 60 years old, this is about you. It's about your future. Where do you want your life to go? What do you want the trajectory of your life to be? And in Proverbs, Solomon says this to us. He says, walk with the wise and become wise. Walk with the wise and become wise. Like Solomon says, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to memorize anything. There's no test to study for. Just walk with the wise. Find the wisest person that you know and start following them and start doing what they do and start letting your brain align, right? And whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, this is good advice. Why? Because wisdom is contagious. It rubs off on us. You do life with people who are wise, and you will become wise. And it's about you. It's about your life. It's about your future. Because we all know this. Today's decisions are connected to tomorrow's outcomes. Today's decisions are connected to tomorrow's outcomes. And your future will be impacted one way or the other by the people that we do life with. But Solomon doesn't stop there. He says, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. See, a fool knows what is right, but he doesn't care. He's careless, right? He does whatever feels good in the moment. But the interesting thing about what Solomon's statement there is what he doesn't say. Because he doesn't say that a companion of fools will become a fool, as he says, walk with the wise and become wise. He says it's far worse. A companion of fools suffers harm. So it becomes a proximity issue, right? Just by being in the place of those people, the closer you are to them, the greater the chances that their poor decisions and their unwise decisions will make you suffer harm. As they go, you go. And you might be thinking, but I don't do the things that they do. They're just friends. They're just acquaintances. And Morin Cerf, our neuroscientist friend, would argue, stick around long enough and maybe you might. Solomon says when you spend your time around fools, you will catch the shrapnel of their bad and poor decisions. And those of us that are parents, we get this, right? We get this. We don't want our kids around certain kids. We don't want them, not necessarily because we think that they're going to do the same things that they do or anything like that, but because when those kids, maybe they've had a history of making poor decisions, and when they make another poor decision, our children may be harmed by those poor decisions. And we want to help our children understand what good judgment looks like. Because here's what we know. Friends who aren't careful with their life will not be careful with your life. Friends who don't care about their health, they aren't going to be concerned about your health. If they don't care about their finances, they're not going to be concerned about your finances. And friends who can only live in the moment and they don't care and they don't look at what they want their future to be, certainly are not going to care about what your hopes and dreams are for your future. And that's not being judgmental. That's using good judgment. Now, I know as a high school pastor, this sounds like something that you would expect a youth pastor to be saying to middle school students and high school students, but this isn't just about teenagers, right? It's about all of us. It's about all of us because when we put our guard down, when we don't guard our hearts and our lives, we can fall victim to the very same things that we're trying to help our children avoid. Only the stakes may be a little bit higher the older that we get. And so friendships and relationships require lines and boundaries. You need to establish a standard that informs you, something that pops off in your conscience when you start veering, bells and whistles saying, hey, something's wrong here. We need to get things back in the center here. And remember that the point of lines and boundaries in our lives isn't just to keep us from doing bad things. Pastor Paul talked about that last week when he talked about behavior modification, right? That's not the point. The point is this, that the lines and boundaries that we put in our lives, and when we choose to stay in those lines and boundaries, light up our conscience and help us before we ever get into danger. And so as we move forward this morning, here's 3 things that I think might help us in keeping relational lines in our boundaries. And these aren't rules, they're just things for us to think through so that regret does not become a byproduct of certain relationships in our lives. Here's the first one. When it dawns on you that your core group or your inner circle or that one person, that acquaintance that's in your life, when it dawns on you that they are moving in a direction different than where you want to be going, that should light up your conscience. That should be a bell and whistle going off right there. And some of you go, but I just love hanging out with this person. We like the same food. We like the same music. We are our favorite sports teams. We have to do the same things. But when you begin to realize that maybe that's the only thing you have in common and where the direction they're going is not the direction that you want to see your future and your life moving in, that should be a warning. And that's a relational line that we should all have in our lives. And it's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's a wisdom thing, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. Here's the second one. When you catch yourself pretending to be someone other than who you really are. Like when you find yourself starting to agree with things on the outside that you know on the inside, like I don't really feel that way, but you start pretending to be somebody else, that should send warning signals to your brain. Don't settle for friendships that force you to be somebody that you are not. Because when that happens, you're lying to them and you're lying to yourself. And if you're lying to them, you're not being a good friend to begin with. And if you lie to yourself long enough, you'll begin to believe those lies, and pretty soon you will become somebody that you never wanted to be in the first place. And the last thing is this. You might be pushing relational boundaries when you hope that the people that you care about most don't know where you are or don't know what you're doing. Right? Even if you haven't done anything wrong, even if you haven't broken any laws, even if you haven't broken any vows, when you start to wonder if they know where I'm at. I hope they don't ask what I'm doing because I really don't want to tell them what I'm doing, right? Because when that starts to happen, there's going to be a temptation to lie to the people that you care about the most. And when that happens, that should be a ding, that should be a bell, that should be a whistle, something going off in your conscience, warning lights saying, hey, this isn't right. We don't want to be here. Now again, the world that we live in will try to tell you this is no big deal. People do this all the time, right? You don't need lines and boundaries in your relationships. But here's why we're so adamant about talking about it. Here's why we're spending a whole Sunday morning talking about this idea. And why we're so adamant about encouraging lines and boundaries in our lives. Because as a pastoral staff, we hear stories all the time of people's regrets, of people who have not put lines and boundaries in their lives, and it has led to a place that they never wanted to be. And many times they wake up, they walk into the bathroom, they look in the mirror, and they start asking questions like, how did this happen? How did I get here? I don't even recognize the person in the mirror anymore. Whose life is this? And the answer to those questions is the same as what it's always been, that our friends and the people that we allow into our lives help determine the direction and the quality of our lives. And it's why we need relational lines. It's why we need boundaries in our lives. It's why we need some of those internal warnings and sirens that go off before we get into situations that we do not want to be in. And so as we wrap up this morning, I want to share some words that Jesus said that were so very significant, but we miss it sometimes. It's not one of those things that is one of his more well-known statements. It's not one of his more famous quotes that we use oftentimes, but maybe it should be. Because when Jesus lived on this earth, he would teach and he would try to help people move in the right direction. And there was a group of people that always had a counter argument to everything that he said. Everything that he would say, no matter what it was, no matter how much wisdom was there, they had an argument for the other side. And so one day, maybe he had just got tired of arguing. Maybe he had got tired of trying to defend the words that he was saying. And so he says this to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders. He says, wisdom is proved right by all her children. So you can argue, you can ask questions, you can try to make it sound like, listen, time will tell. Time will tell. Because there are always going to be people who will try to argue against wisdom. But wisdom will always have the last word. I mean, everything that we've talked about today regarding wisdom, right? You could make a counter argument about, you could tell me why I'm wrong, you could tell me why it's not accurate, why it makes no sense, and you might even be able to win that argument in the moment. But ultimately, even if you win that argument, ultimately you will lose at life because you will end up with more regret in your life. And I think that's the point that Jesus was trying to make. That wisdom is proved right, not in the debate, but wisdom is proved right by the outcome. And when we establish relational lines, It's not a lack of concern or love for other people. Remember, it's not even about other people. It's about you. It's about your future hopes and dreams. What do you want your future marriage to look like? What do you want the future of your marriage to look like? The future relationship with your kids, your future finances. It's not a lack of love. It's an expression of love. Maybe to those who are closest to you. And one day, those people may need you when the results of their poor decisions come back to haunt them, and you'll be in a position to help them because you established some lines and boundaries in your life. Jesus was right. Wisdom will be proved right by her children. Solomon was right. Walk with the wise and become wise. And even the Apostle Paul has something to say about it in Ephesians. He says this, be careful then how you live. Not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. And so I want to encourage you this morning to take some time, to take some relational inventory, to maybe look and establish some lines and some boundaries in your relationships. And if you do, I am certain you will be glad that you did. But if you don't, I think you wish that you had. The band's coming out. They're going to lead us in one more song before we leave this morning. And you can respond to what you've heard by going to one of the response stations around the room while they play. And maybe you want to write out a prayer request. And maybe you want to ask God to help you establish some relational lines in your life. Maybe there are some relationships in your life where you need to place some boundaries or you need to take a step back. It may be as simple as putting lines around your family to protect that time and making sure that this is a priority. It may not have anything to do with being a bad or poor influence in your life, but whatever it is, our staff will be happy to pray alongside you this week and pray with you. Maybe you come from a tradition that lighting a candle is something that you've done, and maybe you want to light a candle as a way to ask God to shine a light on any relationship, to give you courage to put lines and boundaries in those relationships where they're needed. Maybe even remove yourself from that relationship if needed. Or maybe you would want to take communion this morning at your seat and thank Jesus for what he has done in your life and for what he is doing in your life. I want to invite you to pray with me, and then as the band plays, you will be free to respond. Jesus, thanks so much for who you are, and God, that you love us enough that you want us to have lines and boundaries in our lives. And I know that the world will tell us that we don't need those things. That's restrictive. It will keep us from being everything that we want to be. But God, we know that the truth is that true freedom lies within those boundaries. And so God, would you give us the courage to have some self-evaluation, some self-reflection when it comes to our relationships. God, that we would see where there needs to be lines and boundaries established so that we can live our life with as few regrets as possible. We love you so much. Thank you for loving us enough to give us lines and boundaries in our lives. Amen.
Thank you for joining us today. If it was your first time, be sure to text GP Guest to 97000, and don't forget to like and subscribe so that you're the first to know about everything going on here at Gathering Point. Have a great week.